Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm Robert Hazel from the Constitution Unit, and I'm chairing this seminar. Let me briefly, if I may, say two things by way of introduction. The first is, this is very topical. We're in the midst of a general election, and with the help of some of our young researchers, I've been looking at the party manifestos and what they say in terms of constitutional commitments. And a surprising number of the parties do have a commitment to a written constitution. So quiz question number one, what do the Liberal Democrats and the Brexit Party have in common? Answer, they both have commitments to introduce a written constitution, as do the Green Party after a citizens' convention, and the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland, and Plaid Cymru, a written constitution, of course, for an independent Wales. The only parties which don't have such commitments are the two major parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. But the Labour Party have a commitment, if they form a government, to introduce a UK-wide constitutional convention led by a citizens' assembly, which would have very broad terms of reference, which could include working towards a written constitution, the language that Gordon Brown used to use 10 years ago when he was Prime Minister. And the Conservative Party have a commitment to introduce a Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission. And they don't spell it out, but I think it's more likely to be a commission of experts rather than a citizens' convention of the kind advocated by some of the other parties. So that's all by way of election context. Next, unusually tonight, we have a handout, and I'm responsible for that. But Nick and Sionaidh have very kindly acquiesced in this. And it's on your seats, and there are spare copies around if you don't have access to one. Briefly to explain this, it was an imaginative exercise conducted by Vernon Bogdanor 12 years ago with a group of his students in Oxford. And for one term, he set them the challenge of codifying the British Constitution. And what you have here is the product. It's commendably concise and pretty clear, and it's not the only attempt to codify the British Constitution, but for me it's quite a good one, and so it's here just to give you a sense of what a codified constitution might look like. But that's quite enough by way of introduction. Let me introduce tonight's speakers, two constitutional law professors, Sionaidh Douglas-Scott from Queen Mary and Nick Barber from Oxford. Sionaidh is going to go first and present you the arguments for having a codified constitution, and then Nick is going to follow and present the arguments against. We'll then open it up for Q&A. We'll finish somewhere between 7:15 and 7:30, but by 7:30 at the latest. Sionaidh, you're very welcome. Thanks for coming. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much to you and the Constitution Unit for the invitation here. I'm sorry, I got caught on the underground coming here at Edgware Road, and I'm a bit red-faced and breathless and hot, so that may come across in the first words that I say. My talk is going to be divided into basically three parts. Firstly, by way of introduction, I'm just going to talk very generally about what a constitution is, what it's supposed to do. Secondly, and that will be the main body of my talk, I'm going to talk about why I think we need a codified or written constitution. And there will be 5 parts to that, 5 reasons why I think our current constitutional settlement isn't working very well. Firstly, that it's unclear what our constitution actually is, and it's not very accessible to people. Secondly, that it's inadequate in its protection of fundamental rights. Thirdly, there are problems with devolution. Fourthly, entrenchment isn't possible. And fifthly, the piecemeal or ad hoc reform we've had to date hasn't really worked. It hasn't been coherent. It's actually caused problems. So those are the main issues I'll talk about. I'll finish off by talking a bit about process, how we might get to a written constitution. I'm not going to say very much about that, though, in the talk. That might be something people would want to pick up on in questions and take a bit further. Indeed, because I only have 15 minutes, I'm afraid the general tenor of my talk is going to be pretty general anyway, but I'm really quite happy to go into more detail when it comes to question time, if anybody has any questions. So, to start with, the first point, what is a constitution? Why are we talking about it? Well, constitutions, of course, are supposed to set out the major roles of institutions of government, and the relations between them, so between Parliament and the executive, or the courts and Parliament and so on. But also, not just the institutions of government, but the relationship between the individual and the state as well. I don't think there's anything very controversial in saying that that is what a constitution does. Now, I think when it comes to constitutions, though, the rules about core governmental roles are different from other rules of politics or law. But the British Constitution at present doesn't really seem to make much or any by way of distinction between something fairly constitutional, like the Constitutional Reform Governance Act, setting up the Supreme Court, and just your average piece of legislation. A.V. Dicey, the Victorian jurist, said that there's no difference in procedure when it comes to legislating for something like the Dentist's Act and legislating for something that would go to the heart of one of the institutions of government. But when it comes to constitutions, maybe there should be a distinct difference. So that's the second point about constitutions. Sadly, there's a more abstract point about constitutions. It can go a bit deeper because constitutions are really telling us something, not necessarily explicitly, about legitimacy and power, because they are about the role of the state and of government. So they are about when it would be legitimate for government to exercise power, when it would be legitimate for it to do so, not necessarily using physical force or coercion. So there are at least three elements of what a constitution is, or what it does. Britain is one of the few countries that doesn't have a codified constitution. It wouldn't be true to say it doesn't have a written constitution. A lot of it is written down, but not all of it. And usually reasons of history are given as to why Britain doesn't have a codified constitution, that Britain hasn't undergone some of the traumatic circumstances, whether they be revolutions or secession from an empire country, that might have brought about the need for a constitution. But maybe now it's time to think about it. Last point on this first issue I'm talking about, I would put up that one of the key reasons of having a codified constitution is to safeguard really, really important fundamental principles from change on a whim or on some passing partisan interest. There are some things that are so important that it shouldn't be possible to do it, either by the government just deciding that's what it wants to do, so not even through legislation, or through legislation, but only by ordinary majoritarian legislation. For example, you could take Brexit and the referendum as an example of that, where this really, really big change in Britain's constitution will come about, but it will, using the parliamentary processes, come about using legislative processes. It just takes up the majority of one to do that in Parliament. So that's setting out the stall of what a constitution is, how you might find out what it does. I can see already I'm using up quite a bit of time, so I'll have to speed up. So moving on to where things are not working well. And I think really I'm going to boil this down, because I'm a bit short of time, to three main issues. firstly, a lack of clarity in our constitution. Because it's not codified, there are a lot of things that are not written anywhere, so it's quite difficult to discern what is actually going on. And unfortunately, quite a few of those things are very important constitutionally, relate to the royal prerogative or to constitutional conventions, which are political rules, which aren't actually enforceable in the courts, but which are very important constitutionally. To give you an example, the Sewell Convention regulates the relationship between the Westminster Parliament and the devolved parliaments. And because quite a lot of matters have been devolved to Holyrood or to Cardiff, or when it's up and running to Belfast, there is a rule that Westminster will only legislate on matters that fall within the scope of devolved institutions with their consent. Now that's only a political rule, it's not enforceable in the courts. But when it came to the European Union Withdrawal Act, that big piece of legislation that changes the whole nature of our legal system for Brexit, that was legislated in Westminster. It's now become an Act of Parliament without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. Expressly without their consent. They were asked to give it and they refused to do it. So there are lots of things that are not specifically legal rules, but it's not really clear what they are, how they all fit in. The referendum might be another such matter. How do referendums fit in with our constitutional settlement? We are all living in this era where that's a very, very big question, trying to deal with the consequences of the vote on the EU referendum in 2016. But traditionally, referendums have not been part really of, or UK-wide referendums haven't been part of the UK constitution. Indeed, some, Kenneth Attlee, for example, but he was only one such, have said that they are unconstitutional, they're undesirable. And yet there was this referendum, and we are now faced with some people saying that there is a clash between parliamentary sovereignty, the parliamentary sovereignty of a representative democracy, and popular sovereignty as exercised through a referendum. But we don't have a lot of constitutional materials to help us deal with it. So there is a lack of clarity. Second big point in this middle issue, and something that I think is really, really important, is the role of fundamental rights. Now, most written constitutions, and nearly all constitutions in the world are written, they're codified. Britain is an outlier here. Most of them have something to say about fundamental rights. Very often, like in the post-war German constitution, they come at the very beginning of the constitution because they're seen as being so important, so basic. In Britain, because we don't have a codified constitution, we don't have anything like that, but we do have a Human Rights Act. But that Human Rights Act is not entrenched. It doesn't enjoy any special protection. And it could be repealed by a majority of just one MP in Parliament. Indeed, the Conservative Party have in the past said they would like to repeal it and replace it with something else. And that was part of their manifesto at the last election.
And is mentioned.
And is mentioned, that's
in
right.
their current manifesto.
Yeah. So, fundamental rights are lacking in this protection of entrenchment. Not only that, but Britain seems to be moving away. Instead of giving more protection to fundamental rights, we're moving away from it. Because with Brexit, leaving the European Union, we will be leaving the partial constitution, the partial entrenchment rights had through EU law. And particularly the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is not going to be carried over to a post-Brexit future, unlike a lot of EU law, which will be carried over for a time anyway, until a decision is made whether to keep it or repeal it. But the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU has been expressly ruled out. So we're moving away from giving rights more protection rather than the reverse. This is a point that some people have made a big thing about, not just human rights experts, but constitutional experts like Vernon Bolton has stressed again and again how important this feature is. And that means that it would be very easy for a government to do away with rights. And you can think about examples where this might happen, whether it is the rights of Windrush generation, who might be deported, or current EU citizens whose rights are looking a bit precarious right now. So particularly groups who might be seen as being rather unpopular, sometimes groups who don't even have an electoral right, such as EU citizens. They don't have rights to vote in general elections. So they don't have that democratic right to vote. In terms of rights protection, that's looking a bit precarious. Now, it's sometimes said, in response to the point that we need to give more protection to fundamental rights, but then there is a risk of judicial activism, should you do that. Because who will secure that protection, or indeed who will protect a codified constitution more generally? It will have to fall to judges, because you will need to entrench that, you will need to at least stop parliamentary sovereignty as an overriding rule in those areas, and who will do it but judges. So I think there are certain points that could be said to that. First, there are other ways of protecting very important constitutional fundamentals other than through judges. It could be done through parliamentary supermajorities, for example. It has been done elsewhere in the world. You can take the example of the French Fifth Republic Constitution, for example, which is the exact date is somewhere in the mid-1950s, but that constitution lacked strong judicial review. It didn't have the right of judges to strike down things, but it's a codified constitution. But I think the other thing is that when people worry about judicial activism, they think about very often the situation in the United States, where the judges of the Supreme Court have been able to identify constitutional rights that might not even be there explicitly in the written US Constitution. Now, I think there are answers to that. One might be the way we select and appoint our judges is very, very different to the US. They are not made as nominations of the head of state. We have a supposedly independent Judicial Appointments Commission. Also, our judges don't sit for life, as do federal US judges. And that is one of the problems, I think, with the very, very strong strike-down cover that judges have in the US. So I think by saying we really need to protect fundamental rights, one doesn't necessarily leave oneself open to the critiques that one sees of the situation in the US. Okay, now, as time is running on, I'm just going to very briefly talk about devolution, but happy to pick it up in questions if anybody has any questions. It isn't because I don't think it's important, but it's very important. Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, spoke many, many times about our precious union, and yet I think what has been notable has been in the context of the Brexit discussions, how minimal has been the part played by the devolved governments. Certainly the Scottish government has complained about this, but with the exception of the DUP, who are not a government, but were a confidence and supply arrangement with the last administration, there has been very, very little involvement of the devolves, in spite of the fact that Scotland and Northern Ireland both voted to remain in the European Union. And in spite of the fact that the Scotland Act 2016, the Wales Act 2017, have stated that these parliaments should be permanent, and that the Sewell Convention on the rights of legislative consent were at least put on a statutory basis. So I think this is very worrying. It may lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is not actually a very old union. It only dates back, well, you can argue about when it dates back to, but 1707 might be a date to take. The Acts of Union of Scotland and England. So, haven't been together for so long. And of course, Ireland, having been part of the Union in 1801, then left altogether. So, history has various messages to tell us. So, I think devolution is one of the reasons why there might be a need to give greater protection, perhaps entrenched protection, to devolved matters, maybe through some sort of federal arrangement. But I fear it's almost becoming too late now, that the time for that may have passed, and it may be that what we will see is an inevitable falling apart of the UK. Okay, I think I'm going to just finish by a few words about where do we go from now. A lot more to say, but maybe we'll have a chance in discussion to pick up on it. But somebody said, I'm not sure who it was, that constitution building is a bit like dentistry. That there's never a good time for it. No one does it for fun, but it's sometimes necessary, and when it's done right, it prevents greater pain in the future. And I think that's very, very true. But it's also true that I think it's quite hard to move from a position of we ought to have at least a partially codified constitution. We ought to do something to stop parliamentary sovereignty being overriding in every single instance, to saying we can actually do that. And some parties have this on their manifesto as a move towards a written constitution, but not all parties. And I think that is the main problem. Is there a sufficient will? So the first issue is, it's just too difficult to do that. But people don't say, well, people who support Brexit don't say, well, it's going to be so hard we can't do it. There's an assumption it's possible to manage even a hard Brexit. There is seen as a political will and an ability to manage that. So I don't see why it shouldn't be possible to manage some sort of codification for a constitution. We are an outlier here. We're only one of 3 countries in the world that don't have a codified constitution. I can't believe it's beyond the bounds of possibility for us to manage that. So I don't really see this as a hugely strong objection. How do we get there, though? And there are all sorts of possibilities in terms of setting up some sort of body or group that might discuss what form a new constitution might take, whether it be Royal Commission, Constitutional Convention, or crowdsourcing. A lot of those have been under discussion in party political manifestos, read about them in the press. Even the former Speaker, John Bercow, has suggested the possibility of a Speaker's Conference. I'm not going to say I think one is more appropriate than another, but I really do think it would be very important, not just for it to be an experts group. I think it's important to bring people into this, as has been done in other countries. In Ireland, for example, quite recently, over the issue of reform to abortion law, but in Iceland, for example, the recent constitution there was crowdsourced, and all sorts of people participated in that. Final point, what should be in a new constitution? Now, some people just say, let's just pull down the whole thing, strike out again, and have something totally new. The example you have, the Bogdanor et al., I'll call it, constitution, is not a hugely radical example. If you read through it, it builds a lot, I think, on what we already have, but with a few changes, and it incorporates much of the European Convention into the written constitution itself. But it doesn't, unless I miss something, speak of supermajorities or entrenchment or anything like that. What I would say is that I think there are some things that are so pressing that they should be in a codified constitution no matter what. You won't be surprised that I think fundamental rights are one of them. There should be some sort of protection for them that goes beyond the ordinary legislative process. that means overriding parliamentary sovereignty in some situations. Now, parliamentary sovereignty is basically the only one fundamental principle I think we have in our constitution. It's very hard to point to others, although the UK Supreme Court in the recent Miller 2 case did also highlight parliamentary accountability as one as well. But rule of law, for example, which Dicey, who's seen as our constitutional guru, singled out as very important, doesn't really have very much substance to it. And in Miller 2, the UK Supreme Court didn't say that their decision was based on an enforcement of the rule of law. So I think we need to do something about parliamentary sovereignty. And that would definitely change the nature of the British Constitution. I think also that would relate to devolved rights. In some instances, ensuring that devolves were separate and had separate autonomy and sovereignty, as is the case in some federal systems. And that would mean changing current devolved legislation, which in the last run retains parliamentary sovereignty. I also think that we could do a bit about changing our electoral rules. I think our first-past-the-post system is not working very well. Certainly not working very well when it's combined with parliamentary sovereignty, because it's made it so easy for a government that is elected on the basis of a minority of those voting, a minority of the people, to pass a lot of important legislation with only a majority of them. And that is that's certainly not representing all the people who have voices in the electoral system. It means that some votes really don't count for anything. So I think that is something that should be changed, the electoral system. So those are things I think should be changed. And I just close by saying that the current current UK constitution is one that has lasted for about 250 years. Some people see nothing much wrong with it at all. We should remember when it came into being, which was the result of a distinct historical situation, when Parliament flexed its muscles against an overbearing sovereign. And they were right to do so. A sovereign who was acting abusively. But what happens if Parliament itself is abusive? We may be just discovering to find this out. I mean, it could be totalitarian, it could be a left-wing government, it could be a right-wing government. But I don't think Parliament should be that unlimited. Other parts of Britain have discovered this at their peril in our past. The former American colonies in the 18th century, when Parliament adopted laws like the Stamp Act that did not suit them. That led to revolution and independence. Similarly with Ireland, parliamentary sovereignty did not suit them. That led to independence and then the successive troubles. Currently, parliamentary sovereignty is not suiting Scotland. That may well lead to independence or independence. So I think that this is something that has to change. And history doesn't lead in an inexorable direction. The Whig view of history, I believe, no longer should convince us that our current constitutional settlement works well. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for a very clear exposition. And now over to Eric La.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for turning out on such a cold, wet, miserable evening. This session takes the form of a debate. Shona said that she might be hot and red-faced because of the rush into the room. I'm hot and red-faced because I'm angry and passionate. I'm speaking against the creation of a written constitution for the United Kingdom, while Shona is speaking for it. And I think I've got the easier of the two tasks. The easier of the two tasks. Why? Well, because the United Kingdom currently doesn't have a written constitution and is, I think, functioning well without the document. I pause now for the scoffing laughter. If you feel really scoffing, I would argue that the response to the UK Constitution to the issues surrounding Brexit has been exemplary. The Constitution has shown itself flexible enough to deal with what has been an unprecedented political, not a constitutional crisis. You've all been circulated this document. This is Vernon Bogdanall's Constitution, drafted back in 2007 by a bunch of PPE students who were going teaching. And we all know what a contribution If you read it, you will notice that none of the constitutional crises we have faced over the last 2 years would have been avoided if this constitution had been adopted. And that's not because it's a bad document or Vernon did a bad job. He did a very good job in 2007, when nobody foresaw that Britain would want to leave the European Union. I'll talk about this perhaps more towards the end, but each of the three major constitutional crises, Miller 1, Miller Cherry, and the broader constitutional crisis in Parliament about trying to get something done, each of them wouldn't have been avoided if this constitution had been adopted. So, as I was saying, I had the easier task. I'm arguing for the status quo. Now, like any good debater, I want to frame the terms of the debate. So, what would a good argument in favour of a written constitution look like? And let me repeat that again. In favour of a written constitution. Well, it's tempting to point to all the deficiencies in our current constitution, isn't it? And suggest that they need reform. And Sionaidh did this to a certain extent. Proportional representation, problems around devolution, the pesky mess of the House of Lords. All of these, perhaps, could be sorted out in a written constitution. But none of these, ladies and gentlemen, is an argument for a written constitution. These are arguments for constitutional reform in particular areas. You don't need to produce a special constitutional document to deal with them. Yeah? So if, for example, you think we need to abolish the House of Lords and replace it with a second elected chamber, that's fine, but you don't need a written constitution to do that. That isn't in itself an argument for that document. Sionaidh argued that we needed a written constitution because we needed entrenchment. You can't have entrenchment, you might think, if you don't have a written constitution. Well, even that, ladies and gentlemen, I don't buy. I think you can have entrenchment without a written constitution. There is, indeed, already a statute in the British system that is entrenched. The European Communities Act, 1972, which, in factitam, the House of Lords held couldn't be impliedly repealed in the same way that a normal statute could be. Dicey's guff about the Dentists Act was chucked out without a moment's hesitation by the House of Lords when faced with the European Communities Act. And I think that could apply more generally. If, in the United Kingdom, we wanted to entrench the Human Rights Act, we could try. We haven't tried. And if the courts could be convinced that that entrenchment was legitimate and desirable, then I'd be willing to wager every single one of you in this room a very small sum of money that the Supreme Court would uphold that entrenchment. So I think factitam and the European Communities Act shows that in some situations the courts are prepared to uphold entrenchment. I think if the courts could be convinced that entrenchment was justified and useful, they'd be prepared to uphold entrenchment even if introduced in ordinary legislation. So again, you don't need a written constitution to get entrenchment. I am nothing if not helpful, though. So what sort of arguments would a good argument for a written constitution include? What type of arguments are actually arguments for a written constitution specifically, rather than constitutional change more generally? There are going to be two groups of arguments, I suppose. One group relates to process, the other group relates to substance. Perhaps there's something special about the process of producing a written constitution that's valuable and we should want. Perhaps there's something special about the idea of a written constitution in itself that's valuable. So let's look at the first of those to begin with. In terms of process, Jeff King has recently produced a very strong and interesting argument for the virtues of producing a written constitution. I don't know if any of you have seen Jeff's lectures on YouTube. Jeff King argues, that we should have a written constitution because democracy requires it. Democracy requires it. The people should be the authors of the rules that govern them. Self-governance, that's at the heart of a written constitution. At the moment, says King, look at all these old constitutional rules that are floating around the place. And Sionaidh drew attention to this. Bits of our constitution date back hundreds of years. They weren't authored by the people who are currently subject to them. So says Jeff, it's time for a constitutional convention, it's time for a written constitution, a constitution produced by the people. Oh, and by the way, this should happen every 20 years. Every 20 years, a constitutional bell would ring, the constitution, like that Mission Impossible tape, would self-destruct, and the people would have to rewrite and produce a new written constitution. And if you think about it, that's a logical corollary of the argument. If your argument for a written constitution is that the people should be the authors of the rules that govern themselves, then you can't let that constitution sit around indefinitely. After a certain period, there's a new group of people, a new generation, and it's time for that new generation, the Jeffersonian moment, to get to grips with the constitution and rewrite it. Well, I don't have time to respond to Jeff King's proposal in full. It's an interesting proposal. But do you really want that level of instability to be thrown into your constitution? Every 20 years, do you want the devolution settlement to be reopened? In Northern Ireland, do you want the Good Friday Agreement to be reopened every 20 years? Do you want the Human Rights Act to be reassessed every 20 years? I would suggest that in constitutional terms, there's a value to stability, there's a value to leaving things alone when they're working reasonably well and people aren't objecting to them. And there's a real danger with the process-based argument for written constitutions that they destabilise agreements and they open up issues that we would probably be best left keeping shut. The second argument, the second good argument for a written constitution, is made by Vernon Bogdanor and was also made by Sionaidh, I think, when she talked about clarity. Bogdanor argues that people are entitled to know the rules of the clubs they belong to. I wouldn't join a golf club, he said, that wouldn't tell me in advance what the rules were going to be. So why should I join a state that doesn't tell me what those rules are? So we need a written constitution so the people of the United Kingdom know the rules of the club they belong to. The people coming into the United Kingdom, gaining citizenship, can be shown what those rules are. Well, pausing again, this, by the way, is a good argument for a written constitution, because now this is an argument for a written constitution specifically, not a general argument for constitutional reform. 3 counter-arguments. Counter-argument number 1. All of you out there who are would-be constitutional drafters, and who isn't, face a paradox, a choice, a challenge. You have 2 options. One option is you keep it short and sweet, like the American Constitution. The other option is you try to make it long and comprehensive, like the South African Constitution or the German Constitution. If you keep it short, like the American Constitution, then people read it. It can be taught in schools, people will actually look through it. But, unfortunately, it won't bear all that greater connection to the actual set of rules that govern the state. If you read the American Constitution, you're not going to be wildly misled, but you'd be pretty ill-advised to take that as a contemporary statement of the structure of the United States of America, how power in America is structured. On the other hand, the South African Constitution and the German Constitution have a greater chance of being accurate, but nobody's going to look at them, apart from constitutional enthusiasts, such as ourselves. So there's a paradox. If you're writing a constitution, if you want people to know the rules, if you keep it short, those aren't the totality or even close to being the totality of the rules that constitute the state. If you make it long, it might be more accurate, but no one reads it. Second problem, there's always a gap between the written constitution and the actual rules that govern the state. It's often said that the United Kingdom is one of only, was it 2 or 3? 3 states that don't have a written constitution. And sometimes it's presented as that's an argument in and of itself for us to rush to get one. If everybody did that, wouldn't it? But many constitutions around the world are pretty much works of fiction. The state has a written constitution, but it's virtually meaningless. The North Korea, for example, has a beautiful constitution. It's a lovely constitution, democracy, rights, the whole shebang. But you'll learn nothing about North Korea at all from reading the North Korean constitution. The Chinese constitution, similarly, has a really developed and sophisticated democratic structure at its heart, which is pretty much left unused. So this gap between the written and actual constitution also presents a problem for the potential educative function of a written constitution. The written constitution, rather than illuminating and telling people what the rules are that govern the state, may become a mask or a distraction from the reality of the rules that govern the state. Worse still, as time progresses, as things change, the written constitution will become further and further removed from the realities of constitutional law. And that's, I suppose, what's happened with America and the way the American judges have read in various rights and so forth. So, as we move forward through time, the written constitution becomes less accurate. And finally, and it's a small point, if you want to inform people about the core constitutional rules that govern them, I think there are plenty of other ways you can do this without a written constitution. The Human Rights Act, for example, is written in a way that ordinary people can read it if they wish. It is a very accessible document. And we could do more of that if we wanted to. So the devolution legislation, for example, could be crafted in such a way that, at least in the first sections, it was something that would be accessible, readable, and comprehensible. So if our aim is to communicate the content of the Constitution to people through written text, there are other ways of doing that without the problems of a written Constitution. Well, I could stop there. Don't look so hopeful. I'm not going to. I could stop there because having tackled the 2 best arguments for a written Constitution, I could sit down, my work's done, because the onus is on those arguing for change to show why this is needed. But I also have some what you might call positive negative arguments. Things that, problems that producing a written constitution would raise that I think we can avoid by not engaging in this process. Well, first and foremost, I think the dangers of a written constitution, the processes of producing such a document, are that it opens questions that don't need to be opened. So it creates controversy and disagreement where we don't need to have controversy and disagreement at this point in time. For example, the status of the monarchy. Do we want to have a monarchy or do we not want to have a monarchy? That's a really important and difficult question. But I don't believe that today we need to have that debate. If we have a written constitution, if we had a constitutional convention, we would have to face up to that question and we would have to argue it out. But at the same time, we would also have to argue out the future of the House of Lords. Do we want an English Parliament? The voting system? All of these controversial questions, none of which necessarily are pressing today, would have to be raised and thrashed through. Well, wouldn't that be a good thing, Barber? I can see some of you thinking. It's high time we address these questions. High time we faced up to them. Quite right, we have a proper discussion about republicanism, English parliaments, and so forth. Well, even if that's the case, I would caution against doing it through a written constitution. Sionaidh gave the example of amateur dentistry as an analogy to constitutional making. I would give the example of fixing a ship at the sea, in sea, as an example of how you should look at constitutional amendment. When you're sailing your ship at sea, you often need to change bits of it, repair planks and masts and whatnot. But on no account should you try to repair the whole of your ship whilst at sea, because you will sink. Constitutions work because people accept and identify with them. They have what Dieter Grimm calls an integrative function. People accept the Constitution as, broadly speaking, legitimate. They may argue with each other, but they accept the Constitution as a process by which collective agreements can be reached. And they accept the legitimacy of the Constitution for lots of different reasons. In the United Kingdom, I dare say, there are some people who identify with the Constitution because of the monarchy and the House of Lords. They love watching The Crown on TV. There are other people who identify with the Constitution because of the democratic structures of the Commons. You know, they're the sort of leveller type out there. We speak as a people. Still others embrace the liberal egalitarianism of the Human Rights Act and the Equalities Act. Others see the United Kingdom as a union of peoples, a plurinational state of people from Scotland and Wales brought together in a union. These are all features of the United Kingdom Constitution, but often they're contradictory, they're unclear, but by not having a coherent written constitution, by not having an attempt to rationalise the United Kingdom Constitution, we allow people from all those different perspectives to look on our Constitution and identify with it, and it leads to then embracing it and accepting it. So, lack of clarity, I would say, contradiction, can be a virtue in constitutional terms if it permits people from different perspectives to accept and identify in a single document. I know this is an unfashionable view, but don't assume clarity is a good thing in constitutional terms. Sometimes lack of clarity is far better. Finally, if you're unpersuaded by that argument, here's another, cheaper argument. It's a mistake to group together all these unconnected constitutional reforms. You may feel very strongly about the monarchy, you may feel strongly about the House of Lords, voting rights, devolution, the Sewell Convention. Once we produce a written constitution, presumably it would go to the people in a referendum. And then we would be faced with a choice. We would look at the document. You might agree with what the Constitution says on House of Lords reform, but disagree about proportional representation. You might be concerned with the way human rights are treated, but be really pleased with the way the monarchy is dealt with. What do you do then? You find that all these unconnected bits of constitutional reform have been lumped together and presented to you as a package. I don't see why we'd want them as a package. My final objection to a written constitution: producing a written constitution risks further empowering the judges. Now, back in the 1970s and 1980s, people used to write articles about how we needed to rebalance the constitution. There's a very good article by Dawn Oliver to that effect. We need to give the judges more power and a greater constitutional position. I think that's happened. We've got the Human Rights Act, we've got devolution. The European Union debates show the importance of the judges. If we have a written constitution, presumably it would be legally binding. If not, what's the point? And it's hard to see how we would stop the judges getting more involved in our political process. I was looking on the train as I came up at Vernon Boltonell's effort. Here's an example of what might happen. Article 13, subsection 2. The sovereign appoints as Prime Minister the person who appears best able to form a government enjoying the competence of the House of Commons. Well, you say, come on now, Barber, that's an innocuous enough statement of the present constitutional position. Yes, it is, but now it's been put in a constitutional document. It's been written down in a document that I suspect the judges would think was their job to regulate and review. That provision might become judicially reviewable. We might see Her Majesty's judges intervening to decide who the Queen should appoint as Prime Minister. And I think that would be worrisome. I've run out of time, so I won't say how it wouldn't have helped Brexit, but if you are taking the train home and fancy some light reading, have a look through Vernon's document and see if it would have stopped the litigation in Miller 1. See if it tells you whether or not leaving the European Union can be accomplished by prerogative or has to be done by legislation. See if it mentions the word prorogation once, and you'd notice it because it's an unusual word. It doesn't. So written constitutions can't head off these problems because often the problems haven't been foreseen or noticed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you again, Sionaidh. You've left us 40 minutes for Q&A. I see someone hovering by the door. There could be a seat. There are empty seats over here, so do come and sit down. I'm going to take questions in groups, if I may, and groups of 3. Who wants to be in the first round? There's a hand there, there's a hand there. And the third one in this round, and a hand in the middle. Yes. And the next round, these are three men in the first round. So can I encourage the women in the audience, please, to think of a question? We'll have a ladies' round next. Starting with you, sir.
Thank you very much. Apologies for my gender, but it's not something I have much control over. I can see arguments on grounds of tidy-mindedness for bringing all the various existing provisions that are of constitutional nature together, but that doesn't actually, in a single document, single source of reference, that doesn't actually change anything unless they have some special status, unless they're entrenched, unless they're more difficult to change, unless there's some process of popular sovereignty that controls how you rewrite these provisions if you want to do so. But I assume there are different countries, there are different ways of entrenching constitutional provisions, and some may be good and some may be bad, and I'd be interested to know a bit more about the pros and cons of those.
Thank you. So, technique of entrenchment, and I think you, sir, you know, someone someone in the middle here wanted to ask. Man behind you, please. Yes?
Or whatever. One of the last words that was mentioned in the debate was the word prerogative, and I just wondered what the speakers thought of how one might, whether it was desirable indeed to reform the prerogative or to indeed abolish it, and if so, is it necessary to, could one achieve that without either reforming or indeed abolishing the institution of the monarchy, and how does that possibly relate to the idea of a codified or written constitution?
Very good. Thank you. And third one is you, sir, in the blue shirt.
Related to the first question, given lack of mechanisms of entrenchment in the UK and parliamentary sovereignty, how would you initially break the concept of parliamentary sovereignty so that you then can actually write the constitution?
We missed your joke.
I said I had the answer to that question.
We'll come to you next. Sionaidh.
Okay, three questions. First, that tidy-mindedness might not really be a good enough reason, and I agree. Nick said that there was a value to leaving things alone when they're working well enough, and my view, where I differ from Nick, is I don't believe they are working well enough. And in order to make them well, I think we do need to enshrine or entrench certain things. But there is a question of how we do that. And I did say a little bit in my talk that you don't necessarily have to bring judges in. If you read the US Constitution, there's no mention of the sort of judicial review that developed. The judges gave it to themselves. That hasn't happened everywhere. There are examples of other codified constitutions. I mentioned the French Fifth Republic, and this particular aspect of it lasted longer than that particular regime, where you can entrench something very important through some sort of parliamentary majority. So if you wanted to get rid of the Human Rights Act, you might say, well, this statute may only be repealed by requiring a 2/3 majority of all of those present in Parliament. Now, just to come back to what Nick said about entrenchment earlier, you said, well, we can have that. We already had it through the EU and the judges accepted it. Yes, we did have a certain type of entrenchment through the EU. I'd say two things to that, though. One is that it's not necessarily greatly desirable if judges develop all of this without people getting more involved. So I think there would be value in drafting a constitution and bringing lots of people in, rather than have just the judges say, oh, this is a really good idea, we think we should do it. Secondly, the force that EU law has, supremacy over national law, well, the only way that supremacy and sovereignty is going to come about, is going to end, was through Brexit. That was a pretty drastic thing to do. I don't think it's a particularly successful example to give. Much, much better if there can be some greater unity and involvement in deciding what values are so important that they should be given some sort of special protection, and also more general agreement, not just through the judges or those who sign up to some EU treaty, as to how you're going to do that. Second point about the prerogative, is it desirable to reform or to abolish it? I think it would be very hard because most executives have some sort of prerogative power. There are great complaints about the prerogative power that the US president has. And would this include abolishing the monarchy? No, I don't think so. I think there would be value in listing the prerogative powers that we currently have and maybe putting some, quite a lot of them on a statutory basis, so giving the power to Parliament rather than to the government to exercise those powers. Some are more problematic than others. Prorogation, I think, has caused quite a lot of problems recently. And there is a problem with not knowing what the scope of certain things are. And it wasn't at all clear what the scope of the power to prorogue was until the Supreme Court gave their answer to that. And just coming back on this point to what Nick said a bit earlier about the current constitution or the Vernon Bogdanol constitution wouldn't really have changed any of the crises, the political crises over Brexit. I mean, to take the Miller-Cherry case, it was resolved that the Prime Minister could not prorogue in that way. But I think there are still some disadvantages and problems with that decision because the very next day, certain MPs went out and said, oh, this is terrible. We need to abolish the Supreme Court. So if you had a stronger statement of the independence of the judiciary, it would be much harder to do that. Final question was lack of mechanisms of entrenchment. Well, I think I was trying to speak to that earlier, and I do think really you would have to codify at least part, if not all of the Constitution, because the mechanisms we have at present are few and far between and very contested. And they've normally concerned EU law, whether it's been the supremacy of EU law, or whether it was the rather ill-fated EU Act of 2011 that made some effort to sort of semi-entrench through the possibility of a referendum. So I think there would be value in being clearer about that. And there again, I think there's some value in codification. I'll stop at that point.
Nick?
Thank you. So three good questions. So firstly, on entrenchment, there are lots of different forms of entrenchment. You can entrench by requiring a supermajority in the legislature, and we see that in the Northern Ireland Assembly. So the Northern Ireland Assembly, for certain issues, you have to get supermajorities of the Unionist group and the Nationalist group to get legislation through special majorities. You can entrench by requiring the assent of the regions to a change. You can entrench by requiring a referendum with different levels of voting. Or, most interesting, you can entrench by requiring the repealing legislation to be expressed in a certain way. So you can require that the repealing legislation be explicit or even use a particular form of words. Those different types of entrenchment, and there could be other variations too, I think work best if they're tied to the reason for entrenchment. If you can say, well, this is why this law has to be altered in this way. So, for example, if there was a rule that said the Scottish Parliament couldn't be removed without a vote of the Scottish people, that makes sense. You can see why you might want to entrench that legislation in that respect. An interesting feature of entrenchment is it's a cooperative activity. You have two sides to it. You have the body making the entrenchment, which could be Parliament or it could be the constitutional authors, but you also have the courts. It's almost invariably the courts that have to decide whether or not to uphold the entrenchment. The courts can decide to steer around it, or the courts sometimes can decide that the body doesn't have the capacity to entrench, or the courts can uphold it. So inevitably there's going to be those two elements, and you're going to have to persuade the court that it's legitimate and appropriate that this bit of law be made particularly difficult to alter for some reason. So I think it's, and that's why I was arguing that we can do entrenchment in the British Constitution, because if you could show the courts that there was a particular reason why this piece of legislation was entrenched in this way, I think the courts would, as they did in the European context, would uphold it. So the protection of devolution to referendums or approval by the devolved assemblies would be an example of where that might work. Secondly, royal prerogative. Royal prerogative is scary, yeah? If you read some of the older textbooks on the British Constitution, this looks like some sort of weird remnant of medieval power, the sort of thing that William the Conqueror would have, while spinning the thing with the ball and the spikes at the end. But the royal prerogative has got a lot less scary over the last 30 years. It's gone from being an antique remnant of the medieval constitution to being what is in effect an executive power of the type you see in many other constitutional orders. And for that we have to thank the courts. The courts have, since, for a long time, but certainly since the 1980s, steadily expanded their control over the prerogative until it has the same type of controls that you have over statutory power. The court has the authority to determine whether or not a prerogative power exists, and the court has told us that if there's a statute in the area, the prerogative power gives way to that statute. The court has told us that if there's a common law principle operative in that area, prerogative gives way to the common law principle. That's the second Miller case. And once the court has decided that the prerogative power exists, it will then review the exercise of the prerogative power to check that it's been exercised in a reasonable fashion. Rationality review can be exercised over prerogative. And again, what Miller 2 shows, although it doesn't admit, is that virtually all exercises of the prerogative are now subject to rationality review. That's controversial, but I think that's the direction of travel, and that's where we're heading. So I'm not worried about the royal prerogative. It was very scary and alarming, but it's now become an executive power, subject to the same type of controls and checks as other types of executive power. Parliamentary sovereignty? Well, I'm a bit of an outlier on this one. I think parliamentary sovereignty is a myth. Parliamentary sovereignty went in the fact-tame decision. So when Dicey was writing his book in 1880, parliamentary sovereignty was indeed a core feature of the United Kingdom's constitution. Whatever the Queen in Parliament enacts as statute is law. That was the rule of parliamentary sovereignty that Dicey identified, and he was right. But by the time of fact-tame, it was no longer the case that whatever the Queen in Parliament enacts as statute is law, because in that case the court said the Merchant Shipping Act 1988 has to give way to the European Communities Act 1972. So at least part of what the Queen in Parliament enacted didn't become good law because of the decision of the courts. Fact-tame was back in the early 1990s. After fact-tame, the courts have become increasingly sceptical about claims of sovereignty. They use the term when it's convenient. Oh yes. So in Miller 2, they're happy to use the words. But we see the idea of parliamentary statutes, constitutional statutes, as being potential constraints on sovereignty. We see common law principles now as potential constraints on sovereignty. If you go away and read Privacy International, a recent case handed down over the summer, it's, I think, blindingly obvious that the courts are on the cusp of using principles like the rule of law as a constraint on what Parliament can do when it limits access to the judges and the courts. So I think Privacy International is a taste of what's coming when the courts use their review power over parliamentary statutes. I could talk about parliamentary sovereignty in this shift for hours. I know there are other questions, but yeah, it's gone. Although people don't seem to appreciate it.
Let's move to the second round. I suggested this might be a ladies' round. So, generator ladies first round. Yes. So there's a question from the back. And who else wants to be in this round? I saw a hand in the middle there and a hand over there. Yes. So starting with you now. Yes.
I think that you used the word the courts a lot, and I think the danger of not having a written constitution, a codified constitution, is that the constitutional questions will be determined by the courts, and that actually puts the courts as the most important branch of government over the executive and the legislature. And I come from Israel. We have half a constitution. The first parliament in 1949 couldn't agree on the constitution, so they said, okay, let's write the constitution chapter by chapter. Of course, it didn't work because it took 70 years and we still haven't finished the job. And what we don't have is the chapter that says anything about constitutionality of statutes and what happens when a regular act of parliament contravenes a fundamental right. And the courts said 25 years ago, okay, so we have a judicial review of statutes. We, the courts, will decide whether a statute is constitutional or not. And that has led to the biggest controversy in Israeli society today. And that has, some people say, well, it politicized the courts. Because the constitutional questions, especially the questions of human rights, are not legal questions per se. They're also social, political, economic questions. And suddenly the courts have to decide whether the acts of parliament that deal with these questions are constitutional. So maybe it's better to have at least a chapter on this issue, which I saw in the paper that it's not exactly written down, maybe not as well as it should be. It's a good proposal for constitution, but maybe not excellent. And then many of the problems that you've talked about will be solved without giving the courts the supreme power of decision of all issues.
Thank you. Paul.
Well, I promised to deal with entrenchment. But the problem with entrenchment and the Fixed Term Parliament Act just brought this home to me. A couple of years ago, just as an exercise, I drafted my own entrenchment bill based on a 2/3 majority principle, which you suggested was one of the things you could use. FTPA blown aside by a little Act of Parliament, the early Parliamentary General Election Act, which didn't even have the courtesy to repeal the FTPA, but merely overrode it with a single, with a bill to which the 2/3 entrenchment requirement did not apply, thereby blowing apart our assumption that Parliament had wanted us to know that it required a 2/3 majority. Parliament just ignored that. And I think that would happen to any form of supermajority entrenchment. It's not sustainable. So you have to go back, and I think Israel is a good example, and I very much agree that writing the Constitution chapter by chapter is the only conceivable approach, even if it's not the best. But you have to have the beginning of the entrenchment. So you have to have a basic law act which entrenches the 2/3 majority and cannot be circumnavigated by subsequent parliaments. How do you do that? You ask the Queen to abdicate, and then you invite her to become sovereign again if she agrees to this basic law bill, which says anything which is deemed by Parliament to be part of the basic law requires a 2/3 majority to amend. And it's a bit like 1688. You just get rid of the monarch, they're the head of the state, they represent the state, you then invite them to take the throne back on the basis that they agree to the new constitution. And then you've entrenched it. Parliament can't do anything.
Very good, thank you. There were more than 3 hands up. Forgive me, there was one in front.
Yeah.
Do you mind coming in the next round?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So, Alan, yours.
Thank you very much, Alan Rennick from the Constitution Unit. Can I ask each a clarificatory question? The one to Nick is, I'm afraid, again on entrenchment. So I'm not sure I'm convinced by Paul's FTPA example, but what I was wondering was, are you arguing that provisions in the Scotland Act and the Wales Act, the most recent ones, saying that the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly cannot be abolished without a referendum first, have in fact achieved entrenchment? You seem to be saying that entrenchment has happened there, and the Supreme Court would therefore strike down an Act of Parliament that sought to abolish one of those bodies on that basis. And I wondered if that's really what you were arguing. And to Sionaidh, I didn't quite understand your argument as to how we could have rights protection without empowering the courts. I think you were arguing, you talked about the French case to point out that the French case achieved entrenchment through a parliamentary mechanism. But how do you ensure that the law that's entrenched is enforced unless you have the courts involved?
Thank you. There will be another round of questions, but it might be the last round. So those of you who want to ask a question after this set of replies, put your hands up and we'll see. Can I ask Nick this time to go first and then Sionaidh? And if you could keep your replies short, that will enable us to have another round of questions.
Okay, I'll be quick, but these were good questions. So does a lack of a written constitution empower the courts? Yes, it does in some ways. So not having a written constitution does mean that the courts are sometimes put in a position where they have to develop the constitution, they have to decide what the Constitution requires. But having a written Constitution also will empower the courts in other ways. It will be very difficult to produce a written Constitution, I think, that constrains the courts, though if the Conservative Party end up asking the Judicial Power Project to draft a written Constitution, be careful what you wish for, Shona, that could be the outcome. The basic law example is very interesting, and Israel's an interesting example of where the court has, I think, pretty much explicitly said it will decide whether or not entrenchment is justified. So I hope I'm getting this right, but in the Israeli system, it seems you're allowed to entrench in the context of basic law. You can't entrench in the context of ordinary legislation. But the court will decide whether or not a piece of legislation is basic law or not. So the court has jurisdiction to decide if entrenchment is effective. It's very interesting. Another question about entrenchment. They're all about entrenchment. We should send her entrenchment. That'd be fun. Should we ask the Queen to abdicate to protect the Fixed Term Parliament Act? No. That seems a step too far. It's possible to achieve the same goal through double entrenchment. This is common in Australia and other systems too. So you have a provision in the statute that is entrenched, but you also then entrench the statute against being changed using the same mode of entrenchment. So you might say you have a statute that says the consent of the Scottish Parliament must be achieved before it's abolished, but also says, and this statute can also only be repealed with the consent of the Scottish Parliament. So by double entrenching, you protect the entrenching rule against being subverted by another rule.
But no Parliament can bind another.
I think it can. Again, this is another presidential seminar on parliamentary sovereignty. I think that if we had a moment when it was decided that it was desirable that, say, the Scottish Parliament be given constitutional protection, that the Scottish Parliament only be abolishable if a referendum in Scotland were held agreeing to its abolition, and that was passed by the Westminster Parliament, I think that that statute would be effective. I think the judges would be prepared to uphold that statute, and when the Judicial Power Project lawyers rushed in to talk about parliamentary sovereignty, the judges would say, no, that's the 19th century constitution. In our constitution, the value of federalism means that the Scottish Parliament should be protected, and we will recognise that protection, like they did in the context of the European Union. And that takes me to your question. When I was talking about the existence of entrenchment already, I wasn't actually thinking of the Scotland Act, although I think you might be right. I was thinking of the Acts of Union, and there's plenty of dicta dotted around the cases, including in, of course, the case of McCormick and Lord Advocate, but more recently in some of the speeches of Lord Hope, that the Acts of Union may be entrenched against change. These may be acts that the United Kingdom Parliament can't derogate from. But you may raise a nice point about the consequences of those provisions in the Scotland Act. If tomorrow Boris Johnson were to attempt to abolish the Scottish Parliament using ordinary legislation, I would certainly be prepared to go to court to argue that the Scotland Act was entrenched by virtue of that provision. I think it would be worth a go, and I'm not sure that the courts wouldn't uphold it. So I'm not confident enough to say that definitely is. I am confident enough to say it'd be worth a spin before the judges.
Shona.
Interesting questions again. About parliamentary sovereignty and entrenchment and role of the courts. The danger that constitutional questions become determined by the courts is often pointed out as a disadvantage of a codified constitution. On the other hand, judges play fairly important roles in situations where the constitution's not codified. They can do a lot by judicial interpretation. In the Miller-Cherry case recently, there was a lot of judicial interpretation there, stating what are fundamental principles of the Constitution. We can go back in time to earlier cases, nearly 100 years ago, cases like Roberts and Hopwood, which didn't concern legislation, I think, rather decisions of a local council, but the judges were very activist in saying they didn't want provisions of feminist philosophy and philanthropic that would involve in paying women the same wages as men. So I think judges can, by interpretation, do a lot, even if their role isn't enshrined some way in a constitution. If you're worried about judicial activism, I think you have to think about quite what the role of judges should be and think that through carefully, and also think through very carefully how you appoint them, which is something we could give more thought to. How can you avoid rights protection giving too great a role to the courts? I think, Alan, I think of course they would be involved, because under the Human Rights Act as we have now, they decide those cases. But parliamentary sovereignty has been maintained with the Human Rights Act by this provision of a declaration of incompatibility rather than a strike-down ability of the courts. So if they find a statute incompatible with the Human Rights Act, they issue a declaration of incompatibility, and Parliament can then take steps to change the statute, but it doesn't have to. What if you change that slightly? So you said, well, the judges don't issue a declaration of incompatibility, but they state that this law is incompatible with the right to a private life, something like that. Parliament must change the law unless it can muster a 2/3 majority or something like that. I'm not recommending that as a solution. I'm just saying that might be a possible way of doing it. This question about, do we have sort of entrenchment interstitially for certain statutes, whether it's the Scotland Act, whether the Scottish Parliament is permanent or not, because of provisions that it cannot be eradicated without some sort of referendum. Well, I think it would be interesting to see. I mean, the courts might. But I think an awful lot of people in Scotland right now would say, well, look what's happened so far. True, the courts haven't been involved in everything, but when it came to the Sewell Convention, which was specifically legislated for after the independence referendum in 2014, when it looked as if the Scots were going to vote for independence, there was this vow, we will empower you more greatly. The Scotland Act was legislated. It incorporated the Sewell Convention into the Scotland Act, and then that seemed to have been ignored when it came to the EU Withdrawal Act. So I think that there would be a lot of people who would say these types of attempt to enshrine something are simply not worthwhile. It depends on political circumstances. And that's why I think you have to go beyond a sort of interstitial attempt to protect certain values and move to a new type of constitution that simply makes it clearer that in certain circumstances the ordinary legislative process isn't enough, and judges are empowered in certain circumstances to say this legislation is incompatible with certain provisions in the Constitution.
Now we're coming into our last 10 minutes and our last round of questions. And I've got a hand there, and a hand there, and a hand there. So 3 quick questions, please, starting with you.
My question is a bit more philosophical, sort of winding it back. Is that, do you think that the side on which someone should find themselves in this debate really depends if they're a moral absolutist or a moral relativist? And just to quickly clarify what I mean by that is because if you're arguing for a codified constitution, what you're essentially arguing, particularly on the individual's rights to the state, is entrenching and codifying rights that will endure cross time, and therefore you're establishing principles that you're saying should apply hereafter, as it were, and should be very, very difficult to change. Whereas if you're not codifying those, you're arguing for flexibility, because the problem where this manifests itself is most probably in the sort of American Constitution, where judges are essentially putting forward or deciding on cases in a way that the Constitution, the people who wrote it, clearly weren't even conceptually thinking in that space. Yeah, I don't know if that's clear what I'm sort of asking.
No, very good question, thank you. Emily.
I'm glad Nick addressed what I'd call the sort of public engagement and understanding argument. I'd like to move that slightly sideways to talk about public perception. In a time of major political crisis, if you have a codified constitution that might not answer the question, but at least sets out the parameters of that question, it sets out the role of the court, it sets out the principles by which you might answer the question. Do you think the public would actually find that reassuring? It's okay, we can let the judges get on with it, or do you think it would just be more divisive?
And the last question was you, sir.
It's actually very similar to the gentleman who just went first, but essentially the idea of whether there is an intrinsic moral and political value in having a codified constitution. So I think you could argue that in terms of the Brexit situation, all the carry-on in Parliament might not have been avoided by a codified constitution, but it's very clear to me that the national stricture perhaps could have been avoided if we had some sort of guiding principle as to what this union is supposed to be. But it's essentially the moral argument.
Very good. So, closing responses, Shona and then Nick.
Well, moral relativism, moral absolutism, I think, it depends on the Constitution. If you take the US Constitution, you could say, well, here are these things drafted in 1787, 1791, Bill of Rights, and they set out these rights, and then look what the judges have done with them subsequently. No right to privacy in the US Constitution, and yet the judges managed to find it in Griswold in Connecticut and then in Roe v. Wade. And that's even where you have enshrined certain values. But equally, you can have an unwritten constitution where things constantly change. They're in a state of flux, which arguably is much more the situation we have right now. So I don't think whether you want a codified constitution depends on whether you're a moral absolutist or not. And it might depend how you drafted it, the role that you had for the public. I mean, you could be like Thomas Jefferson or Jeff King, who say we change it every 20 years to update it. So there are ways you could take that. Would it be more reassuring to have some sort of statement? Well, I think it depends on the process and how it's gone about. And I mean, obviously, the Human Rights Act, the way it was legislated, something went wrong with that, because for a long while, the public, and maybe still now, didn't fall in love with it. There was almost a hate campaign against it. You would have to be very, very careful about how this whole process took place and how it was publicised to people. And that certain elements of the press couldn't run away with it and turn it into a hate campaign. On the other hand, I think there is a real problem now with judges stating these are our constitutional principles, which might come as news to some people, or with the executive taking a great deal of power to itself because the prerogative is not clear. And although much of it has been clarified by the courts, there are still these dark grey areas, which is why we had to have these two Miller and Miller-Cherry cases. So again, I don't think that a written constitution would stop or prevent some of the political crises that we've had, particularly since the Brexit vote. But I think it might stop us having lost so much in the process, actually, and being such a divided nation. What I fear now is that it may be too late to bring people together again without that actual the need to bring people together and agree on something. Should have happened sooner.
You have the last one.
Some good questions. On the metaphysical question, it's above my pay grade. and I think that normally those sort of big questions tend to play themselves out further down the line. So you could be a moral relativist, but think that your vision of morality is one that you're right to impose on everybody else. Yeah? It's not true for them, it's true for you, you don't care because you're a moral relativist. Yeah? But you could also be a moral absolutist and think the only moral absolute that you buy into is that people should decide for themselves what they should do. So I think the big metaphysical questions actually wash out in the end. On principles, these are Emily's question and your question too, these questions. It might be reassuring. It might be reassuring if we have a written constitution that sets out these principles. But we don't know. So seriously, take this away from you as a free gift from the Constitution Unit. Have a look through it and see if you think it would have helped, hindered, or been neutral in Miller 1, Miller 2, and in the broader problems around Brexit. If we had a principle-based written constitution, maybe it'll make things better, could make things worse, because you'd end up with very broad principles like the rule of law, parliamentary accountability, democracy, subsidiarity, and even separation of powers. And you'd be asking the judges then to go and develop these principles and decide for themselves what they thought it meant. That might give the judges a lot of power and create a lot of uncertainty in the Constitution. It might be what's happening now, actually, if you look at what the courts are doing. it'd be very interesting, I think, for somebody to sit down and write an argument, an article about these common law constitutional principles we see emerging. There's one final thing I would say. Sionaidh's been talking about devolution, and I think the biggest constitutional mistake of the last 30 years was not to have a proper constitutional convention before devolution happened. I don't think that the problems that you point to were caused by Brexit. I think the problems that you point to were caused by a botched settlement back in the late 1990s. And this, maybe I'll end with a confession, I think is the one really good argument, maybe, for a written constitution. If we're going to move to a federal state, then we would have to produce something like a written constitution to produce that outcome. And I think it's a great shame we didn't move to a federal state back in the late 1990s. And maybe you're right, maybe we missed our chance.
It's true that those early, very big constitutional reforms of Blair government in their first term were passed very quickly because you had a huge majority in Parliament. And they were very top-down reforms. And you might say the same about the Human Rights Act.
Yeah.
Anyway, can I just give a trailer for the next seminar, which is our last seminar this year. It's going to be 4 days after the election, on Monday the 16th of December. The title is Election Replay. We have 4 speakers. One of them in this room, Anna Mrenick, is going to talk about the regulation of the election and of the quality of the debate. Meg Russell is going to talk about what will happen in the next Parliament. Ben Lauderdale, who's recently joined us here as a professor in this department, who is the super brain behind YouGov's very sophisticated poll published last night, is going to talk about the polling, and Safar Collignon is going to talk about the candidates and what was different about all the candidates in this election. So I hope all of you who want can come on Monday the 16th of December. Let me close, if I may, with 3 words of thanks. First to Rachel, my colleague, who helps me organise these seminars with her usual efficiency, and tonight to Sam, who prepared the handout, which you will be given as a gift to take away. Can I thank all of you for coming and for your very good questions, and could you please all join me in thanking our 2 speakers for their